Hey guys, Chris Dick here. Thought I'd try something a little different here. I got to put my camera in the lower right hand corner. We'll see if that works and intrigues anybody in any way. What we are going to do today is extend on our user services series here. Now, what I did before in this is I set up a controller that uses the user manager to access a company's enumerable that's on, or collection that's on the user object. Now, this method can be a little bit inefficient, and I want to try to develop something that's a little bit more effective and a little less work on the database. So let's get started here. So what we're going to do is we're going to implement some repository patterns. And using those models, or the models folder, we're going to add in a repositories folder. Now, repositories, just in this case, what we're trying to do is extend the ability of a little bit more strict handling of our data. Using the data context directly, as you can see, as I talked about in part one, you're interacting directly with the database, which means that there's no guidelines or strictness on how data can be used. So what we're going to do is we're going to start building out a few things that, let's see, the repository. So we're going to call this base repository, and we're going to build this out here, and first of all, build in an interface for our base repository. So with that, I'm going to call this iBase repository. Okay. Now, base repository, because we're working with an entity, we need to have, and because we're also building a generic repository, we need to have something that works with a generic. So I'm going to use an argument of type T. Now, type T at the moment is just simply a class. Right now we don't know what it is. It's just an object of some sort. There's no validation rules around it, so we're still looking at just a class. It can be anything. And with that, I can create some functions here. Now I'm going to use the asynchronous model as well. I'm going to do a queryable, and I'm going to say this is a queryable of type T, and I'm going to call this get all. Okay. Now get all is just going to simply say here's everything in the database. You're probably not going to use get all by itself most of the time, unless it's something that is very specific that says, I don't care what it is, just give me everything, and that can be very intensive on bandwidth. So let's also say that we want something where there's a query attached to it, but it's still going to be giving us a list, and we're going to call this get. All right. Now get is going to accept an expression. Expression is a function, and it's a function of T, and returns a Boolean. We're just going to call that a query. So what this will do inevitably is it's going to layer on top of get all and say give me get all, but where it meets this query. The next step, we're going to have something that returns just one item, and I'm going to call this find. Now, one of the things that I could easily do is something like this, where it's just a string. But there's a lot of cases in your database where you really don't know what the primary key is. In other words, what type it is. So what I'm going to do is layer in one more thing here. Is I'm going to add in another generic for key, and my key is going to be like this. It's going to be an equitable, okay, and it's an equitable of type T key. So that allows us to do some easy lookups for equality. Now, because we've now got a key, I can just simply do that. So I can always be looking for a key that is a strict type. Okay. Now, in the logic that we do in our implementation, that's how we'll actually use the ID, and I'm going to work on a way of making that effective and making that work fairly consistently. Now, the next thing what we're going to implement is an add function. We'll start adding in our CRUD operations. So our add, and we have an update. Update will require an ID and an entity. Okay, you may have seen that pattern in web APIs, so fairly similar. We are also going to do a delete, and delete we're going to have one that accepts an ID, and also one that accepts a delete function that will accept T. Okay. Now, the reason we have these two different functions is because we have one that will come from just accepting the ID. So it'll do a find and say, here's the object, and then send out the delete to this one here, which it actually has the entity. Now, it's always wise as well to still continue by saying, all right, let's just make sure that we have the right thing when we do the delete. So you'll probably want to do a check just one more time to make sure that you're still deleting the right thing. Okay, now we want to implement this, and I'm going to do it just like this here. So we're going to do base repository. And base repository, as you can see, requires a T and a T key. Okay. Sorry, my typing is horrible today. There we go. And you're going to see that it doesn't know what T and T key is yet because we haven't specified it. So I'm just going to go up here. All I have to do is just copy it. Okay, and we put that over here. And there we have it. It's all nicely wired up. Good. All right. So what we've done here, because this is a generic repository, we're saying that we have to take a T, so that in this case it's our company entity that we used. Company has a primary key of string, so T key would be string, and I'll show you the implementation later on. What we did the interface for first is that we're going to now have it implement all of these functions for us. And we just do implement interface. Now, one of the things that I kind of wish that Visual Studio would do is add in the async operators here, but we're just going to put them in. Now, one of the things that, because this is a virtual or a generic repository, I'm going to also add in the virtual operator, and that means that if we create a repository on top of this, we can also override some of those functions. So I'm just going to run down our list here and just add in the async because I know that I'm going to use them. Okay, super. Now, when we're working with our repository, what we are also going to do is we're going to bring in our data context because we're working directly with the data context at this point. And that was application DB context. I'm going to call it context. I'm going to add that to our field list here. And as I always do, I'm going to just put an underscore before that just because I know that it's private. Now, by going from that point, what we can now do is we can say context, we can modify some of our functions to actually start doing something. And in this case, it's very simple. We just do the add function. At this point, there's no validation rules, nothing like that, because it assumes, at this level, it assumes that everything has gone through enough checks to know that it's correct. at this level, you might be setting things that are very specific to that entity, maybe, or not very specific, but actually very loosely fit. Maybe all of your objects have create and edit dates. You might set them here. So you can do that at any point. But at the very lowest level, the things that are very common throughout all of your entities, maybe you're creating IDs at this point. I don't know at this point, but the idea is that all of the information at this point has already connected. So we're at delete. Now, delete has to, this one here has a requirement of just using an ID to get the information. Now we don't have a way of finding that information yet, but what I can do is very simply using the stubs that are there. And I can do this. I can do find and ID. Oops, not IT, ID. So right now, find doesn't actually do anything, but as I build through this, it will eventually do that. And now that I've got an entity, I can call my delete function. Now you'll notice I'm not going to put any validation at this point. That at this area here, what I do need to do is validate whether find or the ID is correct. But I'm going to allow find to actually validate the ID. So I don't have to layer in a lot of logic around whether I have an ID or not. Just I'm going to fall back on something that final position where it needs to have an ID. So at the next level of delete, we can do context.remove and entity. Okay. Again, there's no logic around whether entity exists, whether we're valid. Again, we are just simply saying, all right, if you want to delete the entity, I'll delete the entity. Nothing special. Okay. Now down to find, we want to do a little bit of validation, and we will do that in just a second. But what we're going to do is we are going to look into the context.set. You'll notice that I'm using C, and I could do context.companies, but that would be too specific. I have to actually look at the set to get the information that I want. So, and in fact, because we don't want to do this, if you remember, we have our get all and get. That's actually the one that we really want. So we actually want to do something more like this. If we do get, and it's a waitable as well, if you recall, this will be it will return a queryable. So what we want to do is, it's going to be a lot of data if it comes back. We just want to return the first item that matches that criteria. And because we already know that there should only be one, that's how we'll know that criteria is matching specifically. Okay. Now you'll notice here, this is where it gets interesting. You'll notice that I don't have any way of querying ID on my object. So I actually have to create an interface for an entity. Okay. Now my entity, I need it to have the ID. Okay, the ID feature. So I'm going to create a public interface called iEntity. Okay. It is also going to have a T key. Okay. And we're going to tell it that T key is also a type of iEquitable. Okay. So what we have is a T key ID. It's going to be a property, just like that. Okay, so that means that every time a class comes in, if I want for our base repository to always have a specific type of entity, in this case, that entity must always have an ID property, I can now say something like this. Okay, so I want a T key. And okay, now what we're doing here is I'm specifically saying that that T must be a class, but it also has to be have the interface of I entity. Okay, and you're noticing here as well that the base repository also requires that. So we're going to move that right down to there. Okay, now by doing that, it opens up a property to us. And you'll now see that we have ID. Instead of doing the equals, okay, I am actually going to do the equitable side, and I'm going to do that. So we're doing ID equals ID. Okay, this way I can find whatever type it is. It doesn't make any difference. It's just going to say I'm going to find the ID based on its comparables using the equals operator. So we are going to return the entity if it's found. Now here's something that's kind of interesting. Oops, I forgot to mention this. So we want to do, okay, we wrap our await. Okay, and we do first or default. Okay, just like that. So I'm not concerned about getting too deep into a query at this point. All I'm doing is saying, give me the first or default of whatever returns in that list of things that comes back. But because we're looking for something unique, it should bring back the specific entity if I do first or default. There are a lot of ways to do this, so you can experiment with your best ways. Now you notice here as well, this here is indicating that it might be null when I get back. In other words, maybe it doesn't exist. Okay, so I'm going to modify our declaration here so that it returns correctly. And that means I modify my interface just like that. Okay, so now by doing that, it is going to tell me that whenever I find it, I may or may not get a value. If I use that find and I get a null, I have to be a little more careful about what goes in to a function that may be null. So in this case, if I'm using delete, I should do this. Okay, if entity equals null, then I want to throw an error. And I'm going to call it argument null error. And let's just do something like this to give it a little bit more context. And that means that our entity is null. So it's going to throw an error when it hits this if there's a problem. Okay. All right. Now let's dig into what get does. So once again, this is fairly simple. In this way, we do get all, and it's an await again. And we'll just wrap that in some brackets. And we're going to do where. And the where is a query. Okay, and that comes from our parameters there. All right, and then get all is where we actually use that context set t. Okay, and that's going to always bring whatever's in the database. Once again, no filter, nothing. It just says here it is. Okay. All right. Now on the update. Now this is where things get a little confusing. Um, what we may want to do in this case, first of all, we should double check whether the ID and the entity ID are correct. So we should say ID dot equals entity dot ID, or sorry, whether it doesn't equal. Then if it doesn't equal, then we're going to do argument out of range. And you can use a different message here if you want, or exception, but I'm going to use this one. And I'm just going to say the argument out of range is going to be ID, so it doesn't match. ID and entity ID don't match. Okay, so with this, what we can now do is we can do some fancy stuff with our update process. So here we are going to get the entity. Okay, I'm going to edit, await that, and we're going to find ID. Okay, oops, I don't want to call it entity. That's what it already is. So current. Okay. Now, when we know that we actually have an entity, I'm just going to simply do something like this here. I'm going to current not equal to null. If current is not equal to null, then we know that we actually have an object on the database that matches. So we can do entity dot state equals, and we're going to say that this one is now modified because it's going to use all the data within the object to mark it as modified. Okay. So quite simple. This is all we have to do here. We could actually implement an exists function, which requires a little bit less cycles here, but maybe we'll do that later on. Okay, so we've implemented our first repository here, our generic repository. We have an interface, and we also have an entity stub, if you will, or interface that we can use perpetually throughout our application as well. Now, in order to make this work, what we have to do here is we could simply implement it over here now in companies. In fact, let's just do something very simple with our companies. We have companies up here, and I'm going to implement our repository right here. Okay, and it was base repository, type of company, and it is a string as well. And I'm just going to call that repository. Okay. What is it complaining about here? So it's already telling me that company needs something. And that is because company itself doesn't implement the entity that we talked about. All right. So if we go over to our identity models where we had company stored, all we have to do is this. Entity string, and it already has a property of ID, and it has a return type of string. So now it works. So if I go back over to companies, I don't have an error. Now, when we are creating our object, what we want to do is something like this. And we're going to bring in our application DB context. Now, at some point, I may make this an injectable thing, and we'll decide whether we're going to do that, but essentially we'll work with that over time. Now, in this case, you'll remember that we don't have any user context to this, okay? So what we need to do is we will put some depth to this, but you're going to see why this doesn't really work really well. Because what we are going to do is we're going to get all, first of all. Let's just do get all. And I have to await that. There we are. So this way, I can eliminate the user information at this point. But because we're just getting everything in the database, we're going to get maybe someone else's information. So we will at some point have to have some more strictness, if you will, to get the user information out. And if you recall, I used the claims principle here from the user context. We are going to consume that in a moment. So let's just go ahead and run our application. Once we get it up, you'll see again, I can still acquire data, but it's not going to be necessarily filtered. So we'll show you what happens now. All right, so let's go into our companies. Okay, so we have a list of our companies that are in the database. Now, as I mentioned, we don't have any context around the user at this point, so we're going to do that right now. So, stop, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a little function that just gets the user ID from the user context. So now from this, what I'm going to have here is going to be a little private function, and it's going to be get user ID. Okay, we're going to simply do that. Is just like this. So we have our user ID claim, and it looks like that. So we do user.find first, and the claim type that we're aiming for, we're actually looking for a claim types, there we go, dot, let's just add that in, make sure we have it. Okay, dot name identifier. And if we have something, it could be null, so I want to actually get the value. If not, then we don't have anything. So here we have our user claim ID. Okay. Equals null, so we'll do a quick null check here. I'm doing the full work on this because I know that I'm going to use it in the future. So here, if we don't have a user claim, we can just simply throw a new argument, null exception. Okay, and let's just throw that in right there. All right. Now, but if we do have a claim, we want to return it. So, user ID claim Okay. Now, in this case, we don't really know what type user ID is. At some point in our the next video, I'm gonna, as I start to layer on user repositories, I'm gonna probably pull some of this code into it and be a little bit more structured. But in the meantime, we're going to do something like this. So here we are going to layer in. Actually, we're going to consume our get, actually. So we can say get, and we want the user ID equals, and get user ID. Okay, so just like that. Now, because we know that we have a user ID there at the moment, we know that we can query on the user ID. Okay, we're working within the company's controller, so we've got a little bit of leeway. Now, why am I going to this depth? Well, again, a lot of it relates to security and code reuse. Right now, as you can see, we're starting to, we've reduced the lines of code by a couple, but we're also extending queries, and that may not be functionally best either. We also don't necessarily have to do toList here at this moment. We can reserve that until the view renders it if you like, but I'm just going to keep it for now. Let's go ahead and run this and make sure that we still are able to access data. Okay, so we're still able to access data, and that's what's important. That's what we wanted to test here. So there we have it. All right. Now the next step, let's adjust our details here. We can reduce the lines of code yet again by, again, doing something that's a little bit more like this. Okay, and we await that. We can now remove our user manager, and it'll look something like this. However, if you recall, we also have our find, so you could use that method or this method. Actually, now that I think about it, find would also, or would not give us what we want, because it doesn't, get would give us a new rule or a list. What we want it to do is give it just one. So we want it to only return one company. So we'll go back to our details now. We'll see if this works. We shouldn't have any problems in this respect because it's just layering on queries, but we should be okay. We have our list. See what details does. Looks like we're getting our company just fine. Fantastic. Okay. So now we have that. If you remember, details and delete kind of function the same way. So I can actually take this code and bring it right down to the delete, and that's just the one where it's asking, are you sure? This is our point of actually asking for confirmation. So we'll do that one more time, and that'll just kick out our delete and details testing. And when we click on delete, we do have an entity, and it's coming up just the way it's supposed to. Excellent. Okay, so our next one in line here is the create function. And when we access create, we removed this select list before, so let's just get rid of some code. We'll lighten that up a little bit. Now, in our create post method, we're accepting just the name property of company, and we're moving any of the model state errors, that is ID, user, and user ID, and that'll allow it to validate properly. There are lots of ways to validate your entities, but I'm not going to worry about those at the moment. Now, what we have here is we are going to add in the user context here once more. So we're going to start thinking about where does this exist in the user space. So in this case, this feature here isn't bad, but what you're going to see is that I actually have to add in one more quality onto this to ensure that I always have that it's related to the current user and not someone else that's subbing in a user. So if I take away the user manager and I do something like this, user ID equals get user ID. Okay, that's okay. It's not great, and you're going to see what I do later on in future videos. You're going to see how I make some of this disappear. But what we're looking to do here is repository.add, and this is an async. So we've set the ID and we've set the user ID. That way we know that it's always correct. We can remove this line of code and we can keep this one. However, what we actually want to do is add one more layer into our repository, because every time we're saving changes, this interacts directly with the data context. And in the context of a repository, we're adding layers here so that we can do specific functions that relate to the object. So why don't we go into our repository and actually add a method for save changes. So from here, save changes returns a task of int. I'm going to call this save changes. And I'm not going to do anything special to save changes at the moment. In other words, putting in cancellation tokens and that sort of thing. I'm not going to do that. So we've just implemented our save changes here. And all I'm going to do at this point is just simply call save changes async. And we'll just add our async here. Okay. Oops. We need to return. Okay, so right now that all that does is just straight up save changes. But you can see where now I can start to add in some layers around what save changes does before we actually save changes async. So let's go back to our company and we're going to do something like that. Okay. Oops, save changes async. Now I could call it save changes async. It really doesn't matter, but I'm going to keep it with save changes just to keep it simple. All right. So with that, we know that we don't need this view data for the select list here. So we'll simplify our code yet again. Okay. Now from this, we should be able to still function the way we normally do. So let's go ahead and make that happen. All right, from that, we can go to create, and we're going to do a create here. So all we have to do is push create, and now you see that we have an ABC123. If I do one more here just to confirm. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. Great. So we know that we're still able to create. Everything is functioning the way it should. Let's move on to edit. Now, similar to the way details and delete works, edit also asks for an entity. So I can copy that same code once again. And you're probably noticing that I'm reusing code yet again. And I'm going to deal with that problem in a minute, but we're going to keep functioning off using the same code as before. So this should work just fine. Let's find out what happens when we load up our edit. All right, so if we edit, we do have our editability. I just changed that down. Currently, it's functioning the way it did before. We have a valid model state when it's going in. It's still functioning the way it did before. So we're going to modify how the post edit works now. Okay, so from here, once again, what we are doing is we're just doing a repository dot find by ID. We can get rid of the entity, and we're using the update async here on the user manager. That's not going to work anymore, so now we can do our save changes. Now that's going to be okay. The update async on user manager does a couple other things, but primarily it's really just doing the same thing here. Now what we're doing here, because we're not allowing company to update the user or the ID, we're only updating the name. So we're safe in the respect that we're not going to have problems with having to not accept values that aren't correct. In other words, if I changed the if somehow the user ID was coming in as blank, which it will be here, then it's going to need to negate that and simply ignore the fact that that user ID was changed. So in this case, all we're doing is updating name, and we don't have to worry too much about anything else that's going on here. So we have reduced our code just a little bit once again. So let's just try our edit feature one more time. Okay, we'll go into edit, and I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4 again, and we'll save it. Okay, so we're still looking good. We're getting the right information back. We're able to save the correct information, so that's a good thing. Now, one of the things that we are not doing quite correctly is we are not interacting with the user here. All we're doing is straight up getting the information. We have nothing to do with validating whether it's their entity or not. In other words, I could just be going along and saying, I'm just going to edit someone else's ID, throw it in there, and of course that causes security breaches. So what we do have to do in this case, instead of using find, we should be doing our execution based again on whether it's the user's actual data. So we're going to start doing that in a moment, but why don't we do it right now? Let's just do that. So here, we want to do user ID equals get user ID. Now, you can see where this doesn't really work so well if I have to use this all the time. Okay, I'm always asking for the same information, and so why don't I put it into a rule in my controller that anytime I'm asking for this user data, I'm always going to be asking for this query specifically, and that again shortens my querying down quite a bit. And in this case here, I'm asking for first or default again, but I have to do this little wrappy thing here. And first or default. Okay, and that was And you can see that I kind of lose track of my find process. And that was kind of a nice little feature that I had there. So as I say, when we start building into a user repository, we're going to start asking for a few other features that are better in that respect. So let's do a little function changes up here. We're going to add in another function, and we're going to call this, this will be a set that it's going to return. So we're going to do, it's an async function. It's an iQueryable that is being returned. It's iQueryable of company. And we're going to do, I'm going to call this set, just like that. I know it seems a little bit strange, but you'll get my idea in a moment. Okay, so we're going to turn something like that. So that way we can reduce any of these calls where we have this very long information that we're looking for. And in this case as well, we want to keep our find and just allow us to have a little bit more freedom to keep using our find feature, because it's not a bad little feature and it's fairly common to see that find functionality. So let's do task, and this is going to return a company. And if you recall, company is it's a nullable company. And we're going to do something like this, ID. Great. So in this case, we're going to do this. So we do, we want set dot first, oops, dot first or default, and wow, I cannot type today. Okay, dot equals ID. Okay, so we have our find back. All right, now find, that means now we can continue using find. And the reason I'm doing this is because we're going to actually implement this down the road. But you see now that everything we're doing is pivoting on the user. All right. Now there's no magic about this at this point. In fact, you may be saying, "Well, Chris, this is just adding more code." Yeah, perhaps, but let's keep working with this. We're going to look at edit. We don't need the repository again. And over here, we are looking to reduce the code yet again, and we can continue to do find here. So we keep our nice little easy features, but you see we're building in some code reusability, and that's what's really most important here. All right, and down to delete. We can delete the find there. Now we are into our final stages, but with all those little changes, what I should do is just double check that everything worked. So we'll go ahead and do that. All right, now we did our details, so we're still getting the information back that we want. No problems here. We'll do an edit on this one. Okay, everything's working just fine. Delete works. Okay, now finally, what we're going to do is be deleting within the context of the user. So at the very last bit here, we'll make that change. Okay, so our entity, once again, we're going to await find, We don't need our user manager. And we can, in this case, repository, dot delete. Okay. Now, if you recall, we had a delete where we can delete the entity, or we can delete with the ID. I'm not using the delete the ID at this moment. It'll probably be a more seldom used, but if you chose to do that, you could allow yourself to have to remove some lines, and that way you can just throw an error in the repository, catch that error, and do something with it if it does fail. But most important is that in your controller, I like to have a little bit more freedom to do something with each step of the way. But you can choose one or the other. It's not going to make any difference. So let's go ahead and change our save changes as well. And we should be in good shape. So we're going to go back into our company's controller once more and confirm that it worked. Okay, into companies. Now we're deleting an entity this time, so we want to make sure that it's actually deleting the way it's supposed to. We'll do our delete and delete again. Excellent. So everything looks like it's working the way it's supposed to. I'll just do one more edit here and we're in good shape. Perfect. All right. Now, one more change that I'm going to do, and the reason I'm going to make this change is because when I'm working with the objects that I'm doing, I'm going to be ensuring that I always have the current user ID selected on the entities that are coming into us. So this is yet again one more feature that I'm going to implement later on in the next video for the user context. So from here, we're going to call it ensure user ID. And I'm going to say calling it ensure user IDs because I want to make sure that I've always selected the user ID that I'm expecting. So I have var user ID is get user ID. Okay. Now, what's coming in here, this is just going to be a task. What's coming in here is going to be, in this case, it's a company. So I'm just going to call that entity. And that means that entity dot ID user ID equals user ID. Whoops. Okay. So by calling that, I'm going to be ensuring that I always have the current user ID. Yet again, there may be other features down the road that you may want to implement on this, but in this context, we don't have to do that. So this would be a very good example. Okay, that means that we can remove that one line. We haven't made any extra benefit by doing that at the moment, but what we're doing is we're slowly working our way towards more strict behavior when we're implementing things on this context. So thanks for watching. I really appreciate your comments, and if you have anything else that you want me to produce, feel free to leave it in the comments there as well. I will be producing a part 3 to this where we layer on our user repository further. Remember to like and subscribe. Really appreciate the support. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.